Meeting of the Public Audit and Post-Legislative Scrutiny Committee in 2020. Before we begin, can I remind members, witnesses and staff present that social distancing measures are in place in committee rooms and across the Holyrood campus. I ask that all take care to observe these measures over the course of this morning's business, including when exiting and entering the committee room. Can I also remind members not to touch the microphones or consoles during this meeting? Agenda item 1 is decision on taking business in private. Do any members object to taking items 3 and 4 in private? If Neil Bibby or Willie Coffey, who are joining us remotely, object, please raise your hand. That is agreed to take agenda items 3 and 4 in private. Agenda item 2 is the Section 23 report, Early Learning and Childcare Follow-up. Can I also welcome Beatrice Wisher, MSP, who is joining us remotely for this session. I also want to welcome our witnesses to the meeting this morning. Paul Johnston, the Director-General for Education, Communities and Justice. Alison Cumming, the Interim Director for Early Learning and Childcare, both from the Scottish Government. And Eddie Folan, the Chief Officer for Children and Young People. Sarah Waters, Chief Officer, Local Government Finance. And appearing remotely, Matthew Sweeney, Policy Manager, Children and Young People, all from COSLA. I understand that both Paul Johnston and Eddie Folan wish to make a brief opening statement. Can I first invite Paul Johnston to make his opening statement?
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to provide evidence today on Audit Scotland's follow-up report on early learning and childcare. Much has changed since the report was published in March 2020. However, we accept the conclusions and recommendations of the report, and we've got work in hand to take forward the recommendations. We're pleased that Audit Scotland recognised that steady progress was being made to deliver the expansion of funded early learning and childcare by August 2020. They recognised the great deal of planning activity that was underway at both national and local level. They commented on positive partnership working, good governance and progress made in relation to evaluation. The Early Learning and Childcare programme represents a massive financial investment. We're seeking to deliver high quality and flexible childcare to eligible children. And in the long term, we want to secure 3 objectives. First, supporting children's development and closing the attainment gap. Second, increasing opportunities for parents to take up study, training and work. And third, improving family well-being through enhanced nurture and support. I think the committee will agree that the impact of COVID-19 makes all of these objectives more important than ever. It was a difficult decision to remove the legal duty to deliver the 1140 hours by August 2020. However, in the exceptional circumstances of COVID-19, it was necessary. National and local government required to focus on responding to the pandemic and providing critical childcare to children of key workers and vulnerable children, and in addition, capital projects and recruitment required to be paused. We are now working closely with partners in local government to re-establish a date for the completion of the expansion as quickly as possible. And in the meantime, we know that 11 councils are already delivering 1140 hours for all families, with a further 3 on track to deliver the full entitlement by the end of next month. And all councils are providing more than the minimum 600 hours to some or all eligible families. I would like to acknowledge the excellent partnership work that has been undertaken between the Scottish Government and the local government teams, led by colleagues on the panel today. Alison Cumming, as the Director for Early Learning and Childcare, leads a team that is fully focused on the delivery of the expanded offer from within the Scottish Government. And between us, we'll be pleased to answer any questions for the Scottish Government.
Thank you, Paul Johnson. I will now hand over to Eddie Folan for an opening statement.
Thank you. Good morning, Convener. First, I'd like to thank the committee for the opportunity to appear before you this morning and respond to any questions members have on the progress towards the delivery of 1140 hours ELC expansion. Delivering 1140 hours is, we believe, an excellent example of Scotland's 2 spheres of government working in partnership to improve outcomes for children and their families. As set out in the report from Audit Scotland, we were making steady progress towards the delivery of the expanded hours. and this reflects the hard work of councils and their local partners to increase the quantity, quality and flexibility of funded childcare. Members will be aware of the impact of the pandemic and the lockdown had on expansion programmes, and the fact that this required councils to refocus its efforts on critical childcare, support for key workers and vulnerable children. As a result of the crisis, we jointly agreed with the Scottish Government in March to remove the statutory duty on councils to deliver 1140. With the return to nurseries over the summer, councils have been revisiting and revising their plans, and we are working with the Scottish Government to consider when a new date for the statutory 1140 duty can return. Myself and my colleagues are happy to answer any of the questions you have.
Thank you, Mr Follen. I'll open questions on behalf of the committee, then I'm going to hand over to Graham Simpson. Just to kick off, specifically for yourself, Paul Johnson and Eddie Follen, do you want to give us an assessment of where you think the report card is or was pre-COVID, and some of the challenges and gaps were pre-COVID issues, and how many of them are COVID-related issues now? So I think it's safe to say there were challenges before COVID. So I'll just be clear to get an understanding if there's a acceptance from government and councils about what those pre-COVID challenges were, and then what those COVID challenges are.
Thank you. So pre-COVID challenges, I think, were very fairly reflected in the audit report that we have in front of us today. So overall, confidence that were it not for COVID coming in, we were on track to deliver the expanded entitlement by August 2020. We still had work to do at the point of this report on two key aspects, namely workforce and capital projects. And again, both of them are covered, and I'm sure the committee will want to go into more detail on both. But we were seeing good progress being made on both aspects. We have now had this significant period where it has not been possible to undertake capital projects. If I'm coming on to the post-COVID report card. So we've seen delays in those projects, and we saw a pause in recruitment. What we are now doing is gathering data with our partners in local government from all 32 local authorities to come up with a really focused understanding of where we're at in terms of those two key aspects. Where are authorities in terms of their estate, and where are they at in terms of workforce? I think the fact that we're already seeing 11 authorities delivering fully gives us a lot of encouragement that we are not far from being able to set a new date for the full rollout of the entitlement. So certainly today, I'm not suggesting there are not challenges remaining. There absolutely are. COVID has made some of them more challenging. But I think with the concerted effort that is being undertaken between Scottish Government and local government, we will see the full entitlement being delivered as quickly as possible.
I'll come in just a moment, Eddie Follen. So just to be clear, Paul Johnson, are you saying that if COVID hadn't happened, we would have resolved the infrastructure workforce issues by the target, and that all 32 local authorities would have delivered the target?
Our assessment is yes. We were on track to resolve the issues, and we would have delivered the full entitlement.
Okay, and I'm not sure that that's quite what comes out from the Audit Scotland report, but you're clear that you think that would have happened.
We can point to the various ways in which matters set out in the Audit Scotland report had progressed and were progressing even by the time of publication. So for example, just to give one example, the audit report talks about the need for contingency planning in relation to some of the capital projects. By the time of publication, we had seen those contingency plans in place. I think all of the capital projects, Alison could say more about that in a moment. So we'd seen a huge amount of progress. Whether the full flexibility that we might aspire to would have been available in August is something which is probably a matter for debate. Would the entitlement have been offered to all families? We're confident it would have been.
Okay, and the workforce challenges?
Yes, well, again, we were seeing real progress being made in terms of recruitment, in terms of training. We were also seeing, as the audit report highlights, that increased use of private providers who were able to support the necessary who were able to provide the capacity that was needed.
Okay. Eddie Fulham, going back to the first question around report card, and then perhaps some of those follow-ups as well.
Thanks, Convener. No, I think what Paul says is very fair, and I think the Audit Scotland report, set out the challenges that we had. And I don't really have too much to add to that. I might bring Matthew Sweeney in actually on some of the workforce issues, because I know he will have something to say about that. But for us, yeah, the infrastructure issue was a challenge, as was workforce, and I think they remain challenges at the moment, and we're very aware of that. But as Paul says, all the data that we're collecting at the moment shows that we're on track to make good progress. But if Matthew's there, it's always a bit odd, but if Matthew's there, maybe he could add a wee bit on the workforce issue.
Okay. Matthew Sweeney.
Thanks very much. Absolutely, I think that I agree absolutely with the comments that I've made so far from everyone. I think in particular that question of workforce, it can be quite challenging, I think, to split a sort of reality where COVID didn't happen and one which it has. I think so. The fundamental point, I think, was, as you'd expect, a lot of our recruitment was likely to happen over the summer, and there was a bunch of very detailed plans that had happened at local level to make sure that would be timed well, and there have been pipelines put in with local training and other such ways to make sure that workforce was available. Obviously, with the pandemic, it was then impossible to recruit, train and induct staff in the same way, so it's difficult to do that. Now, and I think as Paul Johnson already pointed out, you've seen that councils are those who are delivering 1140, but also those who aren't quite delivering that much are looking to maximise the amount of childcare hours that they can provide in a funded setting. So, those challenges are being worked through currently, and people are working as quickly as possible, as much as they can, to get as much free childcare to families as possible.
Eddie Fulham wants to come back in.
And I think all of that is kind of underpinned by the commitment from councils to deliver 1140. That commitment remains solid. As Paul said, we're working with government to look at when we would restart the statutory duty. But the agreement, the agreement that leaders had to commit to 1140 is still remains. And I think that's borne out by the fact that councils are working to do it.
So similar follow-up question that I had for Paul Johnson. Are you asserting, Eddie Foley, that you believe if COVID hadn't happened, all 32 local authorities would have delivered the target, the infrastructure would have been in place, and the workforce would have been sorted? Are you making that assertion? Yeah,
I think there were challenges, but I think I would agree with Paul that yes, we were on target, and we may have had some issues in terms of flexibility, as Paul said. But it's a big programme. But yes, I would say that we were. So you would assert, yourself and Paul Johnson, that with just a few months to go before we got to August 2020, only half of the infrastructure projects were complete, and half still had to be completed, but that would have been done. Half in a few months. Yep. Sorry, Paul.
A bit more about what we were doing to support the completion of those projects. I think what was critical is they did have contingency plans in place, so where there was slippage, there would be alternative arrangements to accommodate those children. Alison?
Thanks, Paul. Yes, we did see, as Paul has said, by January we had contingency plans in place for all critical capital projects through the work that local authorities had done, supported by the Scottish Government and the Scottish Futures Trust. There was
so just to be clear, sorry, on the contingency plan, that contingency plan would have meant delivering the hours, but not delivering the infrastructure.
Yes, yes, it would have been a way to ensure that the service was delivered, and our focus throughout the programme has been on ensuring that children were able to access their entitlement. Those, to an extent, the infrastructure and the workforce were component parts of making that happen, and that was sort of the plan A. But we had the plan B's and C's in place that if for any reason individual projects, as can happen, didn't complete on time, there was alternative provision available for those children to receive their high quality ELC entitlement. And indeed, we've seen some authorities making use of some of those contingency plans through the work that they've done to respond to COVID and to deliver the expanded entitlement from this August. So we are absolutely confident that all children would have been able to access their funded entitlement. It may not have been the Plan A, but there were absolutely contingency plans in place to ensure that they would still be able to access those funded hours.
So I think Matthew Sweeney wants to come in, but before I go to Matthew Sweeney, so just to be clear, that the Scottish Government's view is we would have met the target in terms of the service, but not have delivered all the infrastructure projects, but had contingency plans for the outstanding projects. Just to be clear on that.
I am confident that we would have delivered the funded entitlement. I can't say for absolutely sure that all the infrastructure projects would have been
I don't
delivered.
think anyone would expect you to say we would complete half the projects in 3 months. So,
but what I can say is that we recognise that infrastructure projects aren't always delivered on time, which is why we had such a focus on putting the contingency plans in place for critical projects.
okay. So of that half that weren't complete, how many were looking like we're going to go to contingency measures rather than be completed?
I don't think we'd collected specific data on the numbers.
You must have had a tracking system.
We did have a tracking system through the Scottish Futures Trust. My recollection is that we were looking at certainly around 90% of the capital projects definitely being delivered on time, and it was that 10% where we were working really hard on the contingency plans and working really hard to get them over the line.
Okay. So we expected 40% to be completed within a few months and 10% to be in contingency?
Yes, although that would have been the ones that were scheduled for August. There
Right.
were some capital projects scheduled thereafter, and a lot of this is because some of the projects that were due to complete were refurbishments or extensions where the work necessarily had to take place in the school holidays when children were not on site. So there were sort of service delivery reasons why certain things had to be scheduled in that summer holiday period.
Okay. I think some people might think 40% is a bit far-fetched for a few months, but okay, I'll take your word for it. In terms of the outdoor centres then, so only 4 of the planned 35 outdoor centres were complete. Are we saying that the 31 outdoor centres would have been completed in time for the target if it wasn't for COVID?
We have seen in terms of the outdoor provision, we invested significantly in supporting authorities and working closely with the Care Inspectorate to improve the registration, understanding of the registration process, to make it easier to make sure that people understood better what was required. We held 5 engagement events on outdoor registration that we termed Quality Conversations, and the Care Inspectorate established an outdoor learning group to support the inspectors who were assessing and registering new settings. We also had 2 cohorts of Care Inspectorate inspectors completing Forestry Scotland specialised training to support that. And since the figures that are in the Audit Scotland report in terms of indoor-outdoor provision, there was a figure of 272 quoted in the report. That had gone up to 281 since then, and about a third of those are open at present. Okay. But in terms of our outdoor aspirations, what we are seeing, and I think in some ways what COVID has enhanced that understanding of the benefits of outdoor play and learning for children, so that the outdoor provision is a factor for every child's early learning and childcare experience, not just in the dedicated outdoor settings.
So are we saying, just like your contingency plans for the infrastructure, we expect that if COVID hadn't happened, those 35 outdoor settings would have been delivered by the target? Or was there contingency plans?
There would have been contingency plans for any of those that were considered critical to the local authorities' numbers.
How many were in contingency?
I don't have those figures to hand. We can certainly provide that to the committee, but I think that the overarching principle is that we had worked and had confidence that local authorities had those contingency plans in place, that provision or alternative provision would be in place for all children who were eligible from August. So
before COVID struck, how many of the 35, because obviously this is an October 29 figure, so say February this year, how many of the 35 were open?
I don't have a breakdown of the outdoor projects as opposed to the remainder of the projects, but we can provide that to the committee.
Okay, excellent. I'll let Eddie Follen and Matthew Sweeney come in any of that, and then I've just got one other follow-up, and then I'll hand over to you. Yeah, no problem. On infrastructure, Alec?
Well, on the target, the statutory
Okay, no problem. On you go, Mr Follen?
Well, I'll ask Matthew to come and convene.
No problem.
Yep.
Matthew Sweeney?
Thank you very much. I mean, there were 2 points which I think were somewhat covered by Alison, but I just think they're important to highlight. I think one of them is obviously in the way that intake happens for ELC is that a proportion of children will start in August and then after Christmas and then Easter again. So it's not sort of like a primary school we're expecting all these children to go in at once. There's a sort of an intake process that goes across, which I think is really helpful context in terms of how this works. And the second thing was, I think this key point is, I think when we think about infrastructure projects, not all of these are building a new nursery from scratch. In a lot of cases, it was perhaps updating part of a nursery. It was, refurbishing a whole setting. But that meant that work couldn't happen until the summer, and it wouldn't be expected, I think, for councils to sort of build something that stood empty for a long time. It made sense for those projects to come online over the summer, and then be ready for when the children were going to be there and needed it. And I think that was the key point. I think with the work that the Scottish Government, ourselves and councils did, was making sure that there was contingency in place for all of the projects which were critical to make sure that the funded entitlement could be delivered.
Thank you, Matthew Sweeney. Did anyone else from COSLA want to come in on that? No? Okay. So going back then, and I'll come to Alec Neil in just a moment. So going back to the target, both COSLA and the Scottish Government have asserted that they believe we would have met the target in terms of delivery, but there were challenges around infrastructure, but 10% would have went to contingency, 90% would have been complete. Seems to be what the suggestion is. On workforce, in September 2019, only half of the additional workforce had been recruited. Are we honestly saying that we would have found the other half by August 2020 if it wasn't for COVID? Are we asserting that as well?
I can certainly start with that on the basis that very detailed planning was being done on an authority-by-authority basis with support nationally as to the way in which that additional workforce would be coming in. And again, as Matthew has said, there was a point about bringing the workforce in at the right time, not significantly prior to those workers being required. But Alison may have some more detail on that.
Yes, thanks, Paul. I mean, we had adopted a sort of contingency planning approach for workforce and had held a national event with local authorities at the end of February looking at contingency plans for workforce, and obviously that different local authorities were phasing their plans, their recruitment plans in different ways, and a lot of it will depend on the strategies that they were deploying. But for example, we were anticipating that there would have been a significant number of new recruits coming from the HNC completing cohort, so the graduating cohort in 2020. So they'd be completing their courses and then starting employment with local authorities and with other providers over the summer. We have also seen, I would say, tremendous success in the modern apprenticeships as a route into early learning and childcare. We set back in sort of 2016-17 a 10% year-on-year target for increases in apprenticeship places, and what we've seen is those figures of almost an average of almost around 20% year-on-year growth in modern apprenticeships, and where the apprenticeships have really had an additional particular strength has been in improving the diversity of the workforce. So it's shown that we are reaching people who might not otherwise have considered a career in early learning and childcare through the apprenticeship route. So that has been very encouraging. I mean, over the last few years, we've invested in additional 3,650 HNC places, and that's additional to the baseline that colleges would be supporting through year in, year out, and seen over 6,700 modern apprenticeship starts in total. So we're seeing those pipelines, those new entrants coming through, and similar to Capital, local authorities were planning to bring people into post at the times that they were needed to deliver services to children. So there were very, very good and valid service reasons why we had significant numbers due to start in post within the 2020 calendar year.
Thank you, Alison. So it was a 50% gap in September 2019. What was the gap in February 2020?
We don't have data for February 2020. We had an agreement through the Joint Delivery Board to collect data with an effective date of September and an effective date of April, based on, as Matthew Sweeney referred to earlier, the intake dates. I'm sure for understandable reasons we paused and didn't proceed with the April 2020 data collection because it felt that it would be a disproportionate burden on local authority teams to be providing that data at a time when everybody's focus was on delivering the critical COVID response.
Thank you. Alec Neil.
No, my question is just in relation to the statutory duty that was removed in terms of the August deadline. A number of authorities, nevertheless, despite the removal of the statutory duty, a number of authorities went ahead and provided the children with what would have been the statutory duty in any case. So my question is, how many of the 32 local authorities did that? And of the others who didn't do it in August, how many are on course, irrespective of the decision and when it becomes again a statutory duty? How many of those who have not yet doubled up to 1140 hours, how many of them are going to do so, let's say, by Christmas?
We have at present 11 of the 32 authorities offering the full 1140 hours to all eligible families, which is a fantastic achievement in the circumstances. We have another 3 authorities on track to roll out to all families over September and October. At the moment, we're going through, you may be aware that we've committed through the Joint Delivery Board to undertaking an assessment of delivery readiness by the end of this calendar year. The next stage in that process is very sort of detailed stocktake meetings with the local authorities who have not yet fully rolled out 1140, and that they are taking place this month. And those stocktake discussions will provide us with that intelligence as to when local authorities are on their current plans likely to deliver. I have to say it's really encouraging. We're seeing more and more developments almost on a week-by-week basis that those remaining authorities, as Paul said in his opening statement, all authorities are delivering more than the minimum 600 hours to some or all families, which we really welcome. And we're seeing in those authorities where they've got a phased approach, rolling out more 1140 on a phased basis through the year. So the process that we're going through at the moment will allow the Joint Delivery Board to consider that evidence of when readiness looks likely across the country as a whole.
Okay. I think it would be helpful, Convener, if we get a list of the 11 authorities, yes, the 3 authorities, those 14, and the 18 authorities, and any update on where they're actually at in terms of getting near to achieving the 1140 hours, and obviously an update on when a decision will be taken as to it becoming a statutory duty again. I mean, I'm not fussed whether it's statutory or non-statutory this year. I'm just fussed that wherever we possibly can, we get to 1140 hours ASAP.
I think Sarah Waters wants to come in on that.
Obviously, COVID has had a very kind of variable effect on local government finances right across the piece. So there are some councils that have had to deliver, for example, huge amounts of critical childcare during the pandemic. They've had to divert resources into a huge range of activity to support communities, all ages within communities. Obviously, there were flexibilities afforded on the ELC funding. And I think very importantly, we're undertaking a piece of work at the moment to look at the 1920 expenditure within councils in terms of revenue and capital, and the 2021. And within the 2021 assessment, we'll be looking at what ELC funding had to be diverted for critical childcare, because that was part of the flexibilities that were afforded. And for some council areas, that will be significant. And obviously that impacts then on capacity, and then it has to be looked at in the context of the kind of wider finances as well, and what that council has had to divert resources into over the last couple of months.
I think it would be helpful, Convener, as well. The councils under that kind of pressure, are these the ones with the most deprived areas, or is it other factors that are influencing that? Because clearly, given the attainment gap, objectives and all the rest of it, if it's very concentrated in areas of poverty and deprivation, then that's going to have a huge impact, not just immediately, but for these kids for many years to come.
I think Alison Cumming wanted to come back in on that.
I can provide you, and we'll follow this up in writing, but I can provide you with the details of the 11 authorities just now and the 3. So the 11 that are delivering in full are Angus, Argyll and Bute, Clackmannanshire, Dumfries and Galloway, Dundee, East Renfrewshire, Inverclyde, Scottish Borders, South Ayrshire, Stirling and Shetland. So you can see that there's a real mix in the characteristics. North Lanarkshire are making very good progress with their 1140 rollout and are on track for full rollout in September.
Right, good.
The other 2 authorities that are on track between now and the end of October are the Western Isles and Orkney.
What about Glasgow and Edinburgh?
Glasgow and Edinburgh are delivering a mix of provision at present, delivering 1140 where they possibly can. I understand that Glasgow City, it's almost all settings that are delivering 1140 hours and that they are working through the remaining COVID impacts to roll out 1140 as soon as possible. Where 1140 is not offered, priority is being given to working families and to vulnerable children to receive an expanded entitlement, and other families are being offered up to 900 hours. In Edinburgh, the most recent information that we have is that 85% of children are receiving the 1140 entitlement at present, and they are offering more than 600 to a number of other families. So we can see that there's really good progress having been made in Edinburgh and Glasgow, as well as in those other authorities that I named.
Good. Thank you.
Graham Simpson.
Thanks, Convener. This was actually the list that was read out by the First Minister last week. Alex obviously wasn't listening to that bit, or he'd switched off at that point. But I think it would be useful if you could send us the full list of councils and where they're at. I think that would be useful to the committee. I think that's what Alex was getting at. Can I just ask, when we talk about 11 councils offering 1140 hours, is it offering or actually providing? Because there is a difference.
There is a difference, and there's a reason for the difference is that unlike for primary schooling, it is an entitlement that parents can offer. It's not an obligation on them. So parents have the offer, their child has the entitlement, and parents can choose whether to utilise some or all of that entitlement. So we're also gathering data at present through the baseline progress delivery exercise that's ongoing to gather data on what the uptake is amongst those authorities that are offering 1140 to all children.
Right. So if I'm a parent with a child that's eligible for this and I get offered 1140 hours, it might not be at the nursery that I want my child to go to. I mean, that's entirely possible. That is going on.
It's entirely possible, and there will always be an element that an individual nursery could be oversubscribed in terms of parental demand as opposed to the places available, and that is a fairly sort of routine circumstance that my local authority colleagues need to have to deal with, and has been is an issue in private nurseries as well as in local authority nurseries. We don't have We've developed a policy for early learning and childcare that's based around flexibility and choice for parents. There's not catchment areas in the same way as there are for schools, so it's perfectly possible and legitimate that there could be a case where there are more parents seeking a place at that nursery than are available, but each council and individual provider will have admissions policies in place to deal with those circumstances.
So do we know how many parents are being offered 1140 hours but aren't taking 1140 hours for various reasons?
We are gathering that data at the moment, and part of we're gathering data not only on how much is being offered, but what the uptake is. So that's work in progress at the moment, and we'll be publicly reporting on that in due course.
And that will be on a council by council basis?
We have, up to this point, we've been publishing the delivery progress data for the expansion at Scotland level rather than at individual authority level.
Why haven't we got the figures on the individual authority level?
There's two reasons really. One is around during the expansion period, the delivery progress data that local government have been sharing with the Scottish Government Delivery Assurance team. There's been an expectation that that's been a sort of a safe space effectively to share challenges and gain support with some difficult issues. We've also agreed through the Joint Delivery Board that it's for individual local councils to have arrangements in place to report their local progress to their local communities.
Cosler, do you have anything to say on that?
Sorry, I might ask Matthew to come in on that.
Matthew Sweeney, who's joining us remotely.
Not a huge amount to add, but I think just to be really clear that in some cases this is a national programme, in other cases it's 32 local programmes, and absolutely I think that some of these questions, you know, are being regularly overseen by the elected members who have the sort of the statutory responsibility, and it's their duty to oversee that. So that type of scrutiny I would expect to be going on at a local level.
Can I ask, I mean, I think there's an issue which I know there's another member wants to focus in on whether you get provision through council provision or private provision. So I'll leave that one. But can I ask a case that I came across, a mother in Cumbernauld who works in nearby Eastern Bartonshire, so it was more convenient for her to drop her child off in Eastern Bartonshire, but couldn't do it because the money wouldn't transfer across this invisible border. Is that something you've come across, and can that be rectified?
We are expecting, where possible, arrangements to be made so that places can be made across borders. Alison may have more to say about the details there.
Yeah, under Funding Follows the Child, and certainly with the full rollout, our expectation is that parents can access places across local authority boundaries. And indeed, my understanding is that there should be an agreement in place between the authorities and the West Partnership to allow cross-boundary placements, subject of course to there being a place available in the nursery. There may be particular challenges at the moment that are COVID related, I don't know, that are having a bearing on operation of that, but certainly my team would be happy to follow up any specific instances, because our policy expectation is that it should be possible to access places across local authority boundaries.
Right, well, I can send you the details of that case, but it would be interesting to know how that's working across the country. It's entirely possible that some councils won't even be aware of this. So we need to get that message out that you know, it does need to be flexible, you know, because people have different work patterns, and we often live next door to another council boundary, and well, you know what I'm saying. Can I just sort of go, and this will be my last question, convener, just go back to this infrastructure question. Have we got any actual numbers on, you know, the number of buildings that are still required to be either built or refurbished?
I have data as at April 2020. I don't have more recent data, so that we know that as at April, and the figures that I have are based on the number of places that around 29% of the planned additional spaces had been delivered in April. And that the percentage of it, but there was a greater percentage of additional spaces required for August had been delivered, so 35% of those places had been delivered. obviously construction work was halted across Scotland and has begun restarting with restrictions over the last couple of months, and the Scottish Futures Trust is working with local authorities now to gather data on their reprioritised capital programmes and to support them in delivering those as quickly as possible. So there will be, I referred to a data collection exercise that's underway with local authorities, which we will publish Scotland-level figures, and that will include an update on infrastructure progress.
Well, that was just a percentage you gave me, so you haven't actually got numbers.
I can come in on that. So the most recent data collection that Alison's referred to from April, we were looking at 912 projects. Now, bear in mind, projects could refer to a whole variety of things. That could be a new build, it could be a refurb, it could be an extension. 912 projects.
Okay, thank you.
Were completed or outstanding?
No, that was the total number of projects that we were looking at that point in order to deliver the expansion. 43% of them, of those projects, were complete by number at that point.
By April 2020?
Yes.
Okay, so 43%, and you're still convinced that you would have got to 90% by August if it wasn't for COVID?
Well, yeah, as we've said,
okay.
we've referred to the various steps that were in place, both to deliver over the summer.
I think anyone listening to that would think that was very, very far-fetched, but we'll take you on that. Alec Neil.
Thank you, Convener. I mean, obviously the biggest issue this year, and for some time to come probably, is the pandemic. So my first question really is, I am told that around about 2016, there was a report produced, one for the Scottish Government, one for the UK Government, about preparing for a pandemic. Nobody knew when there would be a pandemic or what the pandemic would be caused by, but this was preparation for a pandemic. Can you enlighten us as to the status of that report? Could we get a copy of the report? What did it say about preparing for the pandemic in relation to education, educational services right across the board?
I would have to take that one away. I wouldn't want to, so I don't have that information at my fingertips. I can confirm that certainly within the Scottish Government and in conjunction with the UK Government, there has been work done on the key risks facing the country, and the prospect of a pandemic had certainly been identified as one of those key risks, and there would be publications that set out in more detail the sorts of scenarios that a pandemic could bring about in terms of fatalities, in terms of impact, and we can absolutely share as much as possible with the committee.
Well, my understanding is in the UK register, the pandemic is the #1 risk. It's above climate change, it's above terrorism, etc. If that could be confirmed as well, Paul, that would be extremely helpful. But could you specifically come back to us and let us know, was there a report around 2016? What's the status of that report? What did it say about education? In fact, it might be useful if we can get copies of the report itself, just because I would like to measure, how well prepared we've been for a pandemic, and whether this report was just stuck in the shelf and it was ignored, in which case why was it done in the first place and why was it ignored? So that would be extremely helpful. Can I specifically zero in on independent providers? My experience of this is, and I'm talking here about authorities that normally I would rate very highly in terms of their provision in education, very committed to high spending in education, committed to good quality services and so on. But the way in which the independent sector is being treated in the eyes of the independent sector, and I have to say as somebody who is looking at it from the outside with some justification, it raises a whole host of issues. So I would like you to comment on that, and specifically, is there not a conflict of interest in local authorities between being the major provider of early years and the funder of the independent sector? Because it seems to me, and I'm not referring to one particular local authority here, but it seems to me there is clear evidence that the local authorities are siphoning off money which really should be going to the independent sector, and it's being siphoned off for positions and so on within the local authority? And is there not a need to take the funding of the independent sector and have it distributed in a more independent, lack of conflict of interest way to avoid these conflicts in future? Because they are serious.
Let me make a couple of important overarching points and then pass on to Alison to pick up some of the other points that you've made. So we've been very clear from a government point of view that our approach to 1140 is neutral as to provider. So we want parents and carers to have the greatest possible choice of provider.
Absolutely.
We are also working in partnership not only with local government but with the representative bodies of quite a number of those private providers. So when we talk about partnership, we shouldn't see it as simply Scottish Government and local government. We may come on to governance, and those private providers have been part of that, and where possible we're trying to work really closely with them. The final point I would make is we are also seeing the use of private providers increase. Indeed, I think increase slightly more than was projected, and we've been trying to support local government in the way in which they contract with private providers in order to ensure that that is fair, and, for example, includes ensuring that those private providers can sign up to the Fair Work principles and pay the living wage. But Alison will have more to say on some of those
just before
specifics.
Alison comes in, I think if Alison can address this as well, I think the problem, Paul, is that there is no recourse to a third party where there is a dispute between the independent provider and the local authority. The local authority, and it varies, some local authorities are very good at trying to handle this situation, but others are not good at all, and it's big brother time, we're the boss, you'll do what you're told attitude, which is not, that's not partnership. And I think that is one of the more negative aspects of the current arrangements. My own view is that some way there has to be some recourse for independent providers where they're in dispute with the local authority, who in some instances is effectively a competitor in terms of provision, that there is an independent way of resolving that dispute rather than the local authority as a provider and as a regulator. There's a conflict of interest there, and it needs to be resolved to be fair, in my view. Maybe Alison can answer that.
I'll take your quite a specific claim made about councils, so I think COSLA should have the opportunity to address those claims or accusations. Alison Cumming.
Thank you, Convener. I think it's fair to say that we have recognised partnership jointly between Scottish Government and local government have recognised that it's one of the areas that we needed to invest in and improve with the private and third sectors through the expansion. We know that in some parts of the country there's a long history of arrangements working very well and very constructive relationships, but I accept your point that that is not the experience of providers throughout Scotland. We have, throughout the development of Funding Follows the Child, and indeed throughout the development of 1140 and the national standard, we have increased our opportunities to engage directly with private and third sector providers. And I would say that our policy development and developing the national standard has been greatly enriched by having those direct conversations and understanding the context and the experience that they operate in. We have jointly established between Scottish Government and COSLA a partnership forum in 2018 that was designed to bring together local authority representatives, Scottish Government, the national membership bodies and representative bodies for private providers and individual providers to come together to practically work through some national policy issues, but also to understand some local issues of interest and find practical ways through those. That forum had met on 6 occasions and held a national event prior to lockdown. We'd held an event in each of the 6 regional improvement collaborative areas so that providers from across the country had the opportunity to engage there. And we were seeing and are seeing improvements in partnership working through that investment. As Paul has said, our Funding Follows the Child policy framework was intended to be provider neutral, and that was sort of a lot of what we had heard through the blueprint consultation in 2016 about parents' experiences also in terms of being able to access flexible ELC and being able to access, if they wished, their child's entitlement in the private sector. The policy framework is very much set up and designed, and we've been working with local government to implement it in a way which does give that equity and parity to all types of provider. Importantly, all providers in all sectors are subject to the same principles and the same national standard. And a very important part of Funding Follows the Child in the national standard is the payment of sustainable rates, and that those rates need to be sufficient to allow all providers to pay at least the real living wage, the Scottish living wage, to all of their childcare staff. We've also worked with Scotland Excel to produce guidance for authorities on the methodology they can adopt to develop a sustainable rate, and that they involve, and we promote that they involve dialogue and gathering data from individual providers so that they are based as far as possible on knowledge of cost, and that it's transparent in how that rate has been arrived at, so that providers have an opportunity to participate in that. And I know that a number of authorities or regional improvement collaborative groupings have undertaken independent exercises in recent months, probably predominantly pre-COVID, to work with providers to gather that data and set those rates. We know that in the 2 years to August 2019, the average funding rates went up by 26% for 600 hours, and we'll expect to see further increases. So we have been seeking through the multi-year funding to ensure that more of that is going into to recognise the costs of provision and quality provision in the private and third sectors. Alongside the sustainable rates guidance, we have also produced contracting guidance through Scotland Excel, which provides local authorities with some options that they could choose to adopt, which means that their contracting approaches will embody Funding Follows the Child. And the key point about Funding Follows the Child is we're seeking to place the power in parents' hands so that parents have that choice to access their child's entitlement in any setting which meets the national standard, is willing to contract with the authority and has a place available. So we are, this will be quite a big culture shift in some authorities. It will take some time to bed in, but we are seeing a lot of progress being made there, and the policy framework itself is intended, and I accept your observation about where that could be a potential for conflict, but it's intended to ensure that the local authority in allocating, in going through an admissions process and in working with parents on places, treats its own nurseries in the same way as private and third sector nurseries. But my colleagues may wish to comment further on that point.
Thank you, Alison. Coming. I know that Matthew Sweeney wants to come in, but before I go to Matthew, does either Eddie Follen or Sarah Waters want to come in? Eddie Follen.
Yeah, I was going to bring my colleagues in. I think probably all three of us want to get pitch in. But I think just in a general point on partnership, you know, our leaders in 32 local authorities have signed up to this programme, and there will be variation in approach, but I think as Alison's outlined, you know, what we've got is we've got a really strong policy framework, we've got a really strong partnership at the national level, and we've got really strong engagement from local authorities in that partnership as we deliver this. Now, and I know that can still be challenging, but as you've seen, the amount of work that's going on and what is a major expansion shows that, you know, there will be ups and downs in that partnership. There'll be ups and downs, and there'll be there may be areas that need a bit more support. But that's exactly what we're doing with our partners in government. But I'll bring Sarah in first, and then maybe, and I know that Matthew will want to make a few points because he's worked quite intensely on this area.
Sarah Waters.
Yeah, and I think the positive relationship that I think that Eddie and Alison have talked about, I mean, there's a transitional support fund just been launched for third and private sector providers. And I think it was recognised that actually, you know, local government is the one that has the relationship with those providers. So local government is going to, is now, I think it's now live, that the grant scheme is open for third and private sector providers to provide them with support to get through this period, to make the adjustments as part of COVID. But I think the Scottish Government certainly recognised that there is that relationship on the ground, and that it was the obvious place to go for that grant scheme. But I think more generally, in terms of the kind of transparency, the accountability, I mean, this is a ring-fenced grant for a particular purpose, you know, for the delivery of ELC. So around that, there is a lot of scrutiny. There is internal audit, there is external audit, there is the reporting that we've talked about, and you know, so I think that every council is hearing and receiving reports on progress and on how funding has been used, because as I say, it is a specific grant for a specific purpose. And I think I've got very recent local government experience, and I know that certainly on the ground that it is a kind of a very much a team approach. There is not the capacity within councils to deliver this, so it has to be a kind of locally appropriate response from a community planning perspective, and using the capacity that is in each local authority area. And private and third sector providers are a key part of that in many local authorities. But the local government really have had to be the kind of the lead partner and play that leadership role. But that is not at the exclusion of others. That they're part of a wider system, and I think that's really important to note that.
And we'll go now to Matthew Sweeney.
Thank you. I'd agree with all of the points made so far. I think hugely comprehensive answers from my colleagues. I think one thing I'd like to point out is one that, as COSLA, we agreed a set of partnership principles which were co-developed with the National Days Arches Association of Scotland, which set out sort of a helpful checklist that we felt would support local relationships to do that. I think there's a recognition that, you know, there's some work that, you know, that we will continue to do to make sure those partnerships function as well as possible locally. I also think a key point, I think perhaps Alison touched on this, but that the rates have significantly increased in terms of what is being paid already as a result of the multi-year funding agreement. So the data we have most recently is from 1920, and this was only for 600 hours, because obviously the 1140 provision wasn't as fully rolled out as it's being just now, but that was a 26% year-on-year increase in terms of the average rate which is being paid by local authorities to providers for that provision, and that is a result of the guidance that's been, and the sort of new approach which is being taken just now. And I think the final thing I think is quite clear is one, that there is this funding follows the child, and it's not a way I think that we're going to be moving to a position where there's not going to be a set places or a cap, which happened in the past, but it will be based on what individual parents choose. So the decision of the parents will decide where children take places, and I think then obviously the funding follows that as per the model. And also, but key to remember in all of this is that the local authority are accountable. They are a democratic body. They are accountable to their local constituents and their local voters. And I think that's the fundamental point I think we want to make very clear through all of this, is that, you know, they are not unaccountable in how they work, that they, at their core, are answerable to their communities in line with a national policy framework.
Thanks, Matthew Sweeney. Alec Neil.
Can I just come back? Can either the Scottish Government or COSLA tell me what the fund, if I asked you to provide this committee with it, can you provide us with the funding per head for early years for the private stroke independent sector and the local authority itself in each council area? Have you looked at that? Do you monitor that? And if you don't, how do you know that there is fair allocation of resource? So do you monitor it?
Thank you, sorry. We don't monitor it potentially in the way that you've described. We do monitor the funding rates that are paid by councils to private and third sector providers, including to childminders, and the elements of that, so ensuring that that also reflects payment for the meals commitment, for example. The approach that we have taken. There will be reasons why you can't. It's difficult to arrive at a figure for a local authority that would be comparable with that funding rate in terms of taking a simplistic look at the overall funding allocation, because local authorities provide, they often provide services in areas where it wouldn't be commercially viable, so costs are higher to children with...
Can I interrupt you? Sorry, Alison. Come on. You're not telling me with the army of accountants and the army of auditors you have that you cannot distinguish between what are central services provided by local authorities and the direct costs associated with the nurseries they're actually running themselves, and then compare that to the funding for... You in your original answer to this emphasised quite rightly the principle of parity and equity. None of you know. You've just basically admitted none of you know if there's parity and equity because you're not measuring it.
If you'll allow me...
And to be honest, I don't believe in this day and age it's impossible to measure.
My point is not that it's impossible to measure. My point is whether you would have a meaningful comparison in terms of the figures that are arrived at. The focus for the private and voluntary sector funding rates and ensuring sustainable funding is on working with local authorities to equip them with the methods and the tools in order to set a sustainable rate. And in terms of looking at how public money is spent and the value for money and best value considerations around that, it's important that funding rates are based on an understanding of the costs of delivery from private and third sector providers. And the guidance that Scotland Excel produced on our behalf sets out various methods that councils can undertake to do that, which do rely on large part to be successful on providers engaging openly with those processes, so that we can see that we can build up the rates based on the actual costs of delivery, and also allowing for making sure that we have that understanding of the various cost factors and cost drivers for private and third sector. So what we do have assurance of, and what we seek to have assurance of, is that local authorities are undertaking a process of setting those sustainable rates, which is evidence-based, which involves the private and third sector providers, and which also then, and have been based on that evidence, we can also be assured that that represents a best value and value for money in terms of the use of public funds.
So the flaw in that is the cost to a large extent will be determined by the limitations on the funding. You know, it's cart and horse. So if you look at some of the local authorities, I'm not referring to any individual local authority, but, you know, it's silver-plated, which is good, you know, because they've got layers of supervisors and all the rest of it. They're paying higher rates for certain individuals and so on and so forth. And the reason that the costs are lower in the individual sector is because they can't get the funding from the local authority to match what the local authority itself is doing. And I think the role of the government should be, if you really believe in equity and parity, if you believe in it, you've got to measure it, and you've got to measure it objectively and fairly. And nothing I've heard suggests that you're doing that. And I think that's one of the provisions. If we're going to achieve the policy objective, convener, we have to, as an audit committee, make sure that it's properly measured and that we're achieving equity and parity. I don't think you can prove that at the moment.
I think you've made that point very strongly, Mr Neil. Does either Paul Johnson or Alison want to come in on that? Because I'm keen that we move.
One short, very final point of clarification is that rates are not set based on affordability to the local authority. They are set based on the understanding of costs of providers, and one of the undertakings in the multi-year funding agreement was that the funding agreement was set to at a level which allowed local authorities to pay sustainable rates to providers. So they should only be based on cost, not on any affordability considerations.
Thank you, Alison. Coming, Colin Beattie. We're just waiting for your microphone to come on. Sorry, Mr Beattie. Issue with Mr Beattie's microphone. I'm going to move to Willie Coffey and then I'll come back to Colin Beattie. So we go to Willie Coffey, please.
Thanks very much, convener. A number of my questions were asked by yourself earlier on preparedness and so on, but I'd like to just stick with that a little bit. if I could, I think it's nothing short of remarkable what the councils have managed to deliver so far, given where we are. And the figures that Paul read out early are really quite encouraging. But as an audit committee, I'm always interested in whether we've had to incur additional cost because of the impact of COVID. The investment in resources and facilities must surely have been affected by the COVID pandemic and our ability to get premises ready in time. So could you say something a little bit about that, please, and whether we've incurred additional significant cost for the whole programme?
Certainly, and it may be that I should then pass over to Sarah Waters for more detail from a local authority perspective. But yes, additional costs have undoubtedly been incurred and are being incurred. Costs associated with the delivery of critical childcare in the first instance in the whole COVID environment, and now costs associated with ensuring that early learning and childcare can be delivered in a way that that reflects all of the enhanced hygiene and other requirements, and very detailed guidance has come from the Scottish Government about that. Now, the flexibility that was offered by the Scottish Government in relation to 1140 is intended to enable local authorities to meet those costs. But as I think Sarah Waters has said already, work is underway at present to really quantify what those costs are on an authority-by-authority basis.
Yeah, so since the beginning of the pandemic, COSLA has been working with all local authorities and Scottish Government to establish all the additional costs for local government in responding, and that's right across the piece. That's across critical childcare, food parcels, all sorts of measures. And we've been collecting on an ongoing basis all these costs. Now, very specifically, we're now getting into the detail of the funding flexibilities and how those funding flexibilities, what they've been used for and how they've been deployed. So very shortly, I think it's middle of October, we should have information from all councils about the 2021 spend. Parallel to that, we're also doing an exercise about additional expenditure for the safe reopening of schools. Now, obviously, some of that will spill across into schools that have nurseries. So it's quite a complex picture, but obviously what we've been doing as the time has gone on, we've been factoring in any consequentials that have been passed to local government, any other funding that has been passed to local government to support the pandemic, but we are absolutely collecting these costs on an ongoing basis, and ELC and the critical childcare is a key part of that.
Back to Willie Coffey.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. Just waiting for the microphone to come on there. That's quite encouraging as well to hear that. So, but I'm not sure whether there's a commitment yet on the part of the government to fund these extra costs. I sincerely hope that there will be. See, for the councils, Convener, who are nearly there, there's still a bit of work to be done in recruitment, and I think recruitment has had to be paused because of the pandemic. Is there any indication at all when we can kind of begin to get that process underway, to get the staff in place so that we can be ready, and that you, Paul, can perhaps set a new date for delivery of the full programme?
Paul Johnson.
I'm happy to answer that. I think the numbers that we've given around the 11 that are already delivering, the 3 that are about to come on stream, is testament to the progress that is being made. The audit report comments on the robust governance arrangements that we've had in place throughout this programme, and it's those governance arrangements that need to continue to operate as we move to this important phase of setting a new date. So you'll see from the audit report that the overarching governance involves an ELC programme joint delivery board. It will be that board that will be invited in the coming weeks to look at the data that we've got back from the 32 authorities, and on the basis of that to make a recommendation in relation to what a new date should be. And we're certainly working hard to ensure that we're in a place to have that date confirmed as quickly as possible. You know, we want this entitlement to all children in Scotland soon.
Back to Willie Coffey again.
Yeah, thanks again, Convener, and thanks for that answer, Paul. And I wonder, could you just clarify what you said, I think, in response to Graham Simpson about take-up? I'm particularly keen to see, of course, that the take-up is there amongst some of the more challenging communities to make sure that they're taking up the opportunity to use this when it's made available. Are you gathering some data to let the committee and others know about the kind of levels of take-up across the community as a whole?
Paul Johnson.
Yes, absolutely. So we'll see more and more data coming on board over the coming months around take-up, and inevitably there's a bit of a lag. What I think is really important is that we have already published in the last few months the first suite of data and evidence around the baseline for early learning and childcare. So that's the Scottish Survey of Early Learning and Childcare referred to in the audit report. We've already published the first two very extensive publications that give a lot of data about what's going on in terms of take-up and in terms of the characteristics of those accessing ELC. We have still got a lot of work to do. I'll be absolutely open about that in terms of getting more finely grained data around take-up, and there's a huge amount of work on the go, a data transformation project to ensure that we're getting really high quality data, particularly about the qualities characteristics of those who are taking up entitlement. In broad terms, though, take-up of the 3- and 4-year-old offer is very, very high. I think we would say near universal. Take-up of the offer for 2-year-olds still requires a lot of further work. We're seeing encouraging progress, but I think, as the audit report also highlights, we know we've got a lot of work still to do to ensure that all those eligible for the 2-year-old offer are aware of it and are encouraged to take it up.
Willie Coffey.
That's really encouraging again to hear that, Paul. Thank you for that. Last question from me, Convener. It's just about looking ahead, Paul, to see if you've had any opportunity to think about the maintenance of standards and so on and so forth, and to think about the evaluation process, because it's a major policy initiative. It's almost doubling the provision for children that are involved. Where are we in looking at standards, quality, and the evaluation and outcomes and so on and so forth?
Paul Johnson.
So when I was last in front of the committee on early learning and childcare, we recognised the need to be doing a lot more in relation to evaluation. We need to make sure that this very substantial programme of investment is delivering both the short-term outcomes, that's high quality, flexible provision for our children, and that it's delivering those longer term outcomes that I've referred to. It's about closing the attainment gap. It's about helping parents into training and employment. It's about improving family well-being. Those are the things that I know we all care about. And that's where the Scottish study of early learning and childcare comes in. It's a very extensive piece of research and evidence. And as I say, we've already published the first two pieces of that evaluation piece, largely designed to give us that really clear baseline. And what we'll be seeing is further publications in the coming months and years to monitor the full impact of this programme.
Thank you, Paul Johnson. I believe we have resolved Mr Beattie's microphone issues, so over to Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Convener. I'd like to have a little look at the distribution of funding to councils. The report highlights the fact that COSLA leaders did not accept the multi-year revenue settlement for ELC to be distributed on the basis of a formula, and instead revenue funding was distributed to councils on the basis of a financial template. Now, obviously, some councils have received more funding than expected and others have received less. And I have to say, one of the councils in my area, Midlothian Council, seems to have received very much the short end of the stick in that they're 24% less revenue funding than they projected. How do you expect a council such as Midlothian to be able to deliver with 24% less than the projected revenue that they require? And indeed, I'll just mention that the leader of Midlothian Council has been lobbying me for a change to the formula. How does this work?
Paul Johnson.
I'll say something first of all, and then perhaps my colleagues in COSLA would like to follow on. So, as has been said, yes, the approach that was ultimately adopted did differ to the approach that we had been working on, and it involved the financial templates. It involved funding on the basis of the financial template, but with an adjustment. And that adjustment involved us looking at the NRS population estimates from 2014, which were the most recently available estimates at that time. And I think we would all accept that that does mean that in areas where there has been particularly rapid growth, they have experienced greater challenges in terms of their finances. So I recognise the figures in relation to Midlothian. My understanding is Midlothian is the fastest growing area, local authority area in Scotland by quite a long way. What I understand Midlothian is doing in particular is ensuring working very hard to deliver in the context of that rapid population growth. Also important to note that work is now underway in terms of what the longer term funding situation should look like for early learning and childcare. The current arrangement goes into the 2021-22 financial year. Beyond that, decisions have still to be made, and the sorts of issues that you raise in relation to authorities experiencing rapid population change, I think need to be taken into account in that context.
Does anyone from COSLA want to come in on Mr. Beattie's question? Sarah Waters?
Yeah. So I think when the template exercise was undertaken initially, it was obviously that there was a difference, I think, in the estimates that Scottish Government had made for delivery and what local government felt was an appropriate quantum of funding. And obviously the template exercise, I think, was done twice to kind of establish a realistic quantum from a local government perspective for delivery of this service, factoring in all the aspirations around the policy and the delivery. The professional the view that was presented to COSLA leaders, obviously the opinion from through the COSLA governance and the governance that Scottish Government and local government is involved with, that it should be based on a distribution. So you had the quantum that was available, but that a distribution basis should be used for the funding. The risks were highlighted to leaders around exactly what you've articulated. If you distribute based on actuals, then what you're not factoring in is the ability for that annual updating of the indicators, as you would with any client-based approach. So those risks were highlighted. Obviously, the decision was taken democratically by leaders, and that's the situation we're in for the current arrangement. Now, Alison and I have mapped out the rest of the year, looking at, in fact, we had mapped out most of the beginning of this year, looking at what we will do going forward from 22-23 onwards, because it's really important that we get a sustainable funding model going forward. We absolutely want councils to be able to cope with the population growth, to ensure that the delivery is on a sustainable footing going forward. So we had hoped by June this year that we would be taking a report to leaders again and recommending to ministers what would be sustainable going forward in terms of distribution, but obviously that work has been paused. We expect that we're able to get that work back up and running for, I think we'd planned out till Christmas, and that would obviously involve looking at the quantum going forward, but also the basis for distribution, so that we do take account of the types of issues that you've highlighted, Mr. Beattie.
So there is going to be a revision of the funding exercise in the future, because, as you can well understand, council's got to plan ahead. Midlothian's not alone, it's just the worst.
What Alison and I are very aware of, we need to do that work sooner rather than later, because what we want is to give councils a very, very good lead-in time for post multi-year settlement. So I guess that will be next year is going to be our first year of business as usual. We had hoped that business as usual would be 21-22. That is unlikely in terms of ELC. So we're in quite, it's a difficult position, because we thought we'd have more information about what it costs to run an ELC service of this type. We won't have that until a little bit later, but rest assured we're doing the work now to make sure that councils have certainty as soon as possible in the next calendar year.
Why pick 2014? There's much more up-to-date figures available. Why 2014?
I think that That was the best available data, I think, at that time when the templates were being done.
If I could pass to Alison for more information on that, please.
Yeah, at the time that the local authority estimates were produced, the National Records of Scotland 2014 estimates were the most up-to-date available on a local authority by local authority breakdown. So there were NRS 2016 estimates available, but they were only available at Scotland level. And the political agreement that was reached between COSLA leaders and Scottish ministers was to apply the NRS 2014 estimates as the ones that were available on a local authority level at the time that local authorities were producing their financial estimates.
I think one of the important things that certainly I've taken on board here is the fact councils like Midlothian have got to plan ahead. And this is now 2021-22. That's not that far ahead in terms of council planning. And councils need to go for medium and long-term planning. And if they have an unsustainable gap in their funding, then it's a real problem for them. How do they plug that gap? How do they move money into that service? And it does seem disproportionate that they're 24% down. It does seem very harsh.
Who wants to comment on that? Paul Johnson?
I would simply say that my understanding is that despite the challenges that Midlothian are facing in terms of their population, they are making good progress within their available budgets in terms of working towards 1140, and Scottish Government, COSLA and the Improvement Service will be working with Midlothian to support them and other authorities that are not yet at the 1140 entitlement. That's something which I can assure the committee is being taken forward now and will continue to be done over the coming weeks.
Are you comfortable with that level of underfunding that they will reach the 1140?
Well, as I say, that's what we're continuing to work through with Midlothian and other authorities that are not yet there, not yet at 1140. But my understanding is all authorities are expecting to deliver 1140 within the current available funding. We don't yet have the new statutory obligation in place, and we need to do that detailed work with those that are not yet there. But I'm certainly anticipating that within available funding it will be delivered. Whether, and I think the audit report actually mentions this, whether it means that for some areas there may be less flexibility and less choice than they would aspire to is of course possible, and is something that we're going to have to work through.
Okay. Just one other thing I'd like to look at. I think actually Alison Cumming may have touched on this about the living wage. And the report indicates it's unclear whether the living wage commitment will be fully implemented, both on affordability and enforceability grounds. You know, you did touch on a few aspects of this. Could you maybe fill us in a little bit more about the background to that?
Yeah, sure, I'm happy to. I'll probably take the affordability point first, if I may, because that's slightly simpler to set out and explain. I believe that the point that was made in the Audit Scotland report was around the fact that local authorities were setting their sustainable rates now after the funding deal had been agreed. And there could be an issue, as Mr Neil alluded to earlier, what would be the issue if the sustainable rates exercise, including payment of the living wage, produced a rate that was higher than had been factored into to the funding agreement. That is not the case at the moment, so we don't have any concerns over affordability. The multi-year settlement overall is there, and for individual local authorities to be able to pay those sustainable rates. The challenges that we do have around the living wage are not specific to early learning and childcare. They're about the complexities in the context of the Parliament's devolved competence and interaction with various other elements of procurement law as to what can be enforced in relation to payment of a wage that's not the legal minimum wage set in statute. We have undertaken extensive work with procurement specialists, including in the local government procurement specialists in Scotland Excel, to work through how we can have the contractual mechanisms in place that can support this shared aspiration from Scottish Government and local government that all childcare workers delivering the funded entitlement should be paid at least the real living wage. So there are some very specific ways that we've, through the guidance that Scotland Excel has produced for local authorities, that are possible. So the national standard, forgive me, this could get quite technical, so I'll try and keep it brief. The national standard sets out fair work practices as one of the areas that we expect all providers delivering the funded entitlement to meet. If the provider does not provide sufficient evidence to the local authority that the Fair Work criteria is being met, it is permissible for the local authority not to contract with the provider. So there's an element that the payment of the real living wage, we would consider that to be a significant factor of how a provider is showing their commitment to fair work practices. So local authorities in their procurement and contracting processes can treat that as a key indicator of whether the fair work practices are being met. There's also scope within the terms and conditions that the local authority agrees with a provider that in accepting the sustainable rate, a provider acknowledges that an element of this rate reflects an expectation that there is payment of at least the real living wage to all childcare workers delivering the funded hours. So I agree it's not straightforward. We've been working, as I say, very hard to find the mechanisms that we can to ensure that this aspiration and this commitment is delivered. The other point that I would make is that there will also come to be business reasons and other incentives for providers to pay the real living wage to their providers in terms of attracting and retaining staff. We know the benefits that come through payment of the real living wage in terms of productivity, absenteeism and staff morale across the piece. That's not about the ELC sector. And prior to this commitment coming in, we also had a number of private and third sector providers who were living wage accredited. Now we're not, as part of the national standard, looking for all providers to reach that extra level of accreditation, but it does demonstrate that it is possible to have business models in place which ensure that it's sustainable to pay at least the real living wage to childcare workers.
Now, the report refers to the Living Wage Implementation Group, and I can't remember if you referred to that yourself, but it was due to meet early in 2020. Has it in fact met, and who is represented on that?
It hasn't met, it's not met, and that's really as a result of our focus and the focus of our partners being elsewhere as a result of COVID. We are working to get that up and running as quickly as possible, and the role of the group will be to support implementation of the commitment, particularly in terms of practical support to providers, provide advice on monitoring and evaluation of the payment of the real living wage, and to gather wider evidence on the terms and conditions in the early learning and childcare sector. The membership we would expect to be made up of Scottish Government, local government, trade unions, representatives, and also individual providers, and that is the basis on which we've been working with partners to get the group up and running.
Thank you. I'll come to you just in a second, Mr Simpson. Can I just go back to Mr Beattie's question about Midlothian Council? So the 24% revenue negative, so the revenue gap, how many councils have a negative revenue gap?
Won't have that information immediately to hand.
Okay,
while
Alison's looking for it, you said, Paul Johnson, that that Midlothian still made good progress, and that you still expect councils to meet the statutory obligation when the new date is set, and I think Midlothian should be congratulated for that. But do you recognise that when there is a revenue gap, they have to make the shortfall up from somewhere? And what you inadvertently or deliberately, people can make their own judgment, are making councils do is perhaps have to make cuts elsewhere in order to meet an obligation that they have on childcare. So Midlothian has to make up that 24% from somewhere. So you're asking Midlothian to find that money from somewhere, meaning a different service is perhaps being cut. Do you accept that?
So I do not have the details of the way in which Midlothian, to take that example, are planning to deliver 1140 within their funding allocation. I don't know if
how do you think they're planning on? How do you think they're planning on filling the 24% gap?
Well, I think in some ways we'd want to get more detailed information from Midlothian about that, because I wouldn't want to necessarily conclude without hearing that detail from them directly.
And you haven't asked up to now?
That they're making. Well, there will be colleagues in Alison's team who are working in detail with Midlothian, and it's certainly more detailed information which I'd be very happy to take away and to provide the committee with, unless Alison has more to say.
But you accept they have to find the money from somewhere?
Well, they either have to find the money from somewhere else, or they have to find ways of delivering the service within the available budget. And as I say, that could be about using some contingency arrangements. It could be about not being able to offer as much flexibility and choice as they aspire to. I think there are a range of approaches that they can take. But Alison.
Yep, please, Alison, come in.
So just a brief point. I'm aware we have worked with Midlothian Council because it was a multi-year funding agreement, and local authorities had sort of effectively set their own phasing in the estimates for the pace at which they would arrive at the full 1140 rollout. We have had discussions with Midlothian and allowed them to carry forward funding that was planned for phasing into the delivery years to help them smooth that element, which obviously then had an impact on the extent to which they were able to phase ahead of this year. I think the difficulty for us in commenting too much further on this is that it was a political decision that was taken through democratic processes to go with a distribution basis based on the local authority estimates. But just in relation to the earlier question that you asked, Paul, that paragraph 23 of Audit Scotland's report states that 12 councils will receive less revenue funding than they estimated the expansion would cost.
Can you list those 12 councils?
I don't have that information to hand, but we can provide that to the committee.
Are any of those 12 in the 11 that have currently reached the 1140 target?
I don't have that information to hand, but we can provide that to the committee.
Okay, excellent. And do you recognise, though, that the gap has to come from somewhere, and when you are putting more and more pressure on local authorities in terms of their whole budget, and then asking them to deliver a new service and not give them adequate funding to deliver that target and service, you're piling on even more pressure, and then perhaps in some ways shifting the blame when a target isn't met or when services are cut?
I certainly don't think our approach here has been around shifting blame. I think it has genuinely been around partnership, working together to find ways of delivering the 1140 hours.
I mean, beyond the 1140 hours. I mean, as an envelope of funding that goes to a local authority, I accept there's great partnership working on the 1140. That's a good thing. But if you're not giving adequate funding for 1140, and you're creating a statutory target for 1140, and at the same time the overall budget is being squeezed for that same local authority that has to deliver that statutory obligation of 1140, that does create pressures, doesn't it? And means having to make difficult decisions, and difficult decisions often means cuts, maybe libraries closing, maybe other services getting cut. You can't look at these things in isolation, can you?
I agree that we need to look at things in the round, and I'm very conscious in my engagement with local authority, very frequent engagement with local authority chief executives. They are making difficult choices in relation to funding, as of course is the Scottish Government in relation to the range of pressures versus the available funding. So I don't seek to suggest this is easy. I would want to make clear, though, that we would say that looking at Scotland as a whole, we have put in place the necessary level of funding in order to deliver 1140, given that that was done at a Scotland-wide basis by COSLA as a whole, with support from Scottish Government.
I'll come to Eddie Follen and Sarah Waters in a moment, but you said it was a political decision to agree the funding model. You'd also accept it's a political decision to agree the funding envelope for local authorities?
Yes.
Okay. Eddie Follen.
No, I want to emphasise the partnership approach, convener, because I think, you know, what we've tried to do is work really closely, and what we have done is work really closely with government on this to make sure that we are supporting authorities. And we at COSLA, you know, we're constantly discussing with our members the pressures on them in relation to funding, and those are significant, you know, and it's not just around early learning. So those are significant challenges that local authorities face, absolutely. And just to return to that, you know, that it was a decision of all leaders to kind of go for that model. But you know, as Sarah said, and she may want to touch on it again, you know, we are looking at it again, and we're planning that out with the Scottish Government. And I think that partnership approach that we've got at the national level can only help councils who are in those difficult positions, and that will be our approach. But Sarah may want to add.
Sarah Waters.
Yeah, I think, convener, what you describe is exactly the argument that COSLA puts forward every year about the core funding. We use that term frequently, the kind of unprotected bits of spend that are subject to the cuts. And I think what we want to work with government to get to a place where we define a quantum going forward for ELC that doesn't do that doesn't sort of rob one part of the council to pay for another. This has got to be a sustainable service that sits at the centre of a community's resource, and we really want to be like that. It's going to help parents, it's going to help employers, it's going to help, you know, the wider community. So we've got to make sure that we get onto a sustainable footing for 22-23 onwards, and do it in a way that is equitable across councils. I think the template exercise that was undertaken to define a realistic quantum was done in that spirit. I think what then happened was obviously a political decision was taken. That wasn't the spirit of doing the template exercise. That was to define a realistic quantum.
I'm really pleased you said that, Sarah Waters, because I know there'll be councillors across the country watching this and would probably have expressed their frustration if you hadn't said what you have around the wider context being considered when we're talking about these things, whilst also recognising that partnership working on these issues is really, really important. Bill Bowman. Sorry, Graham Simpson wanted to come in, then I'll come to Bill Bowman.
It's just to follow this line of questioning. So it's one question, convener. Well, what you've all described is essentially a postcode lottery across Scotland, where some councils are getting 1140 hours fully funded and some are not. So I think what this committee would need is the list. I think it was 12 councils you mentioned. So those councils that aren't getting the full funding, and also in those councils, Paul Johnson, you mentioned earlier that in relation to Midlothian, they may have to make tough choices. So parents in Midlothian and presumably other councils won't be getting the range of childcare choice that parents in other councils will be getting because those councils are not fully funded. So I think I would certainly like to know which councils there are, the level of underfunding, and how that is affecting choice in those council areas. So I'm not necessarily asking you to respond, but just to come back with that information.
Paul Johnson.
Happy to follow up with further information on that point.
Excellent. But you know that information, like it's somewhere.
I think we should be able to get that information and share it with the committee.
Before I come to Bill Bowman, just show me, based on that funding model, are there any councils that get a bonus in the sense of they get more than what is going to be the revenue cost? So are they getting a funding bonus from the current model?
I can see why you would be asking that, and I'm not. Would my colleagues like to comment on that point?
Eddie Foley?
I suppose the distribution will be the distribution, but Sarah's probably got more expertise on that than me, so I'm going to let her.
Sarah Waters?
Yeah, I think it's because we, you know, the template exercise was done in good faith. It was done to define costs over a 3-year period, and I say it was done in good faith, and it was done for a particular purpose. It was then used as the basis for distribution. So it comes back to each council submitted the costs that they felt, or the expenditure that they felt was necessary to deliver that service in that local area, depending on geography, rurality, socioeconomics, demography, all those factors that come in.
But do any councils have a bonus?
based on the costings that they put in, they got what they submitted as part of the template exercise. So they are delivering the service that was planned.
But Midlothian didn't. So I don't think we can say they got what they wanted because Midlothian didn't. So if they didn't get what they said they needed, and instead a funding model was used where some got significantly less than what they needed, Midlothian getting 24% less, what I'm asking is, does that mean that no one got more than what they needed based on what they submitted? Or did some people get more than needed and you couldn't do a corrective exercise by diverting some of that money where people might have got more to those that didn't get what they thought they needed? Because it's wrong to say everyone got what they needed.
So my understanding, Convener, is that given the use of the population, the 2014 population estimate that we've referred to, it is the case that if an area, for example, has got fewer children than that estimate had set out, then they should be finding it should be more comfortable for them to deliver, potentially offering a greater variety of choice and flexibility. So I think, I see the line of argument from the committee, and I think it does point to what we're saying about the need for these issues to be addressed going forward. And I also think I'm clear that we can provide the committee with further detail as to the breakdown.
So if you could please provide the breakdown of what people think they need based on now, what they got based on the model that was agreed as a political decision, the range of councils who got what, so Midlothian being the worst hit with minus 24%, and which councils got plus whatever percentage. I'm surprised you don't know the answer to that offhand, but please do share that information with the committee, because surely some corrective exercise could have been done if someone had, say, plus 6%. That plus 6% could have helped be redistributed to poor Midlothian at minus 24%. So I think we need some more detailed information on that, please. I'll take Sarah Waters and I'll move on and go to Bill Bowman.
I think when leaders took their decision as well, there was a factual statement that was prepared for both COSLA leaders and for ministers. So that factual statement went into the detail about what was being done in terms of the population adjustments. There was other small adjustments about for capital in relation to SFT rates that was factored in. So that factual statement was part of the decision making that led leaders to take the decision that they did, and they were aware of the population adjustment. That was done because some of the estimates that had been, I mean, there are projections, estimates, and they're not absolutes. They are projections, and I think we just need to always be clear. If you move to a distribution model, what you're doing is using the mid-year estimates, which are more about what has actually happened in reality, as opposed to projecting what's going to happen over the next 5, 10, 25 years, which is what NRS do.
Thank you, Sir Waters. My apologies, Mr. Bowman. I believe Mr. Beattie wants to come in again, so I'm going to go to Mr. Beattie, and then I'll go to you, Mr. Bowman.
Thank you, Convener. I just wanted to ask for a fairly obvious clarification. No council received more than they asked for, but they perhaps received a larger portion of the pot that was available than other councils like Midlothian. Would that be correct?
Population adjustment was the factor that would have perhaps made it more comfortable, I think was the term used for some councils. It was not the fact that they got more than they asked for. The population adjustment, which, as I say, was put in the factual statement for ministers and COSLA leaders as part of their decision-making tools, if you like, or what led them to make that decision.
So sorry, Sarah Waters, I think the point that Mr. Beattie is getting at is, if you take the measure where Midlothian is minus 24%, are there any in that same measure that are plus a percentage? And if you might not have the answer offhand. If you could please come back to us with that answer, that would be helpful. Happy to move on, Mr. Beattie? Yep. Bill Bowman.
Okay, thank you, Convener. Good morning. I'd like to move on now maybe from the execution to the governance aspects of the programme. When the committee took evidence from the Auditor General before, we discussed the exhibit on page 11, exhibit 2, if you're familiar with that one. And the report suggests that the governance arrangements for delivery are quite complex. Can you tell us where does an audit committee and internal audit fit into these arrangements?
Certainly. So I was pleased to both read what Audit Scotland had to say about the arrangements. I agree there is complexity to them, but I think they are robust. And I know that when the former Auditor General for Scotland gave evidence to this committee, I think in June, she said a bit more about the governance arrangements, and I'm happy to expand on them. So here we see the governance, in Exhibit 2, we see the governance arrangements for the programme. The programme also has maintains a risk register. And in overall terms, the programme fits within the education portfolio in the Scottish Government. So the expenditure sits within that portfolio. I am the accountable officer for that portfolio. And I have regular meetings around both assurance and risk management. Alison, as the director for the area, participates actively in those meetings. They are also attended by both internal audit and by Audit Scotland. At those meetings, we look at the risk registers. We've been looking recently in the COVID context at the most pressing risks in each of the portfolio areas. We scrutinise those risks with input from both internal audit, external audit, and indeed non-executive directors.
Excuse me, is that an audit committee meeting you're saying? Or?
Yes, so it's an audit and assurance meeting, and I chair that meeting for the Education, Communities and Justice portfolios with input from internal audit and external audit. What we can do there is agree on whether any matters require to be escalated to the overall Scottish Government Audit and Assurance Committee. And that's the overarching committee that's looking at the totality of Scottish Government spend.
So you have an audit committee that's chaired by a civil servant?
Yes, with input from internal audit and external audit. In terms of the portfolio one, I chair that with that external input. The Scottish Government's overarching audit and assurance committee is chaired by a non-executive director.
So if you take this diagram, can you show us either now or later where audit committees actually cover these individual blocks?
So I'm happy to follow up in writing if it's helpful. But the audit committee that we have is looking at the key risks and issues associated with the 1140 delivery and other issues and risks associated with other aspects of the portfolio. So it's not a discrete audit committee only for this programme. It's an audit committee that looks more widely.
But does it cover everything on this?
It covers the totality of the programme, yes.
And are there minutes available for that group?
Well, there are minutes available from the overall from the portfolio committee, and indeed from the Scottish Government's overall audit and assurance committee.
And when did you last meet to discuss this?
Well, the last meeting of the audit and assurance committee was in August. I can't remember the date of it, but it's been in recent weeks, and we've been seeking to ensure that we're looking at a really proactive way at the key risks that we are facing given the implications of COVID.
And just listening to some of the topics this morning from talking about allocation of funds, postcode lottery, surplus and deficits, how do we know that has been given the appropriate independent scrutiny?
Well, I point to Audit Scotland's independent scrutiny as one key aspect.
Okay, I understand, sorry, maybe I shouldn't use the word independent, but independent within the Scottish Government, not independent from outside, like a non-executive director.
Yes, that's where I would look to the role of our internal auditors and to the role of the non-executive directors in the Scottish Government with whom we work very closely and who are part of the audit and assurance meetings that I've referred to.
So the topics we've heard about this morning, have they come up at this committee?
Certainly the committee is aware of and has discussed the 1140 ELC programme. I think some of the details that we've just got into have not been discussed, and they are ones that I would be I would be happy to take away and ensure they are
would
discussed.
they have been discussed if it hadn't come up at this committee?
Well, I think it's the Audit Scotland report has highlighted some of these issues, and of course the committee's scrutiny is a hugely valuable way of ensuring that they're looked at in more detail.
I think that's not exactly the role of the committee. It's checking up rather than saying what should be done. So I take it from that then, these issues that we're discussing this morning have not really been raised internally at an audit committee level.
So the detailed issues that we've just discussed around funding for different local authorities have not been raised specifically at an audit committee level. Whether they have been, I would expect though they have been raised and discussed in detail in, for example, the ELC Finance Working Group, which you see as part of the governance. Maybe Alison could say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, certainly the ELC Finance Working Group, I think, is another strong example of our partnership between Scottish and local government and having a formal forum within the governance structure for looking in depth and in a candid way at the various financial issues. The Joint Delivery Board, obviously the Finance Working Group reports into the Joint Delivery Board, and financial issues are escalated as required to that Joint Delivery Board. We have a non-executive member insofar as somebody who's not directly involved in the programme sitting on that board. It is another senior civil servant, but that has always been delivered to give that challenge, that expertise in delivery of complex programmes. We've also undertaken a series of gateway reviews throughout the programme, so that brings in some independent scrutiny in terms of the processes and the arrangements that we have in place to ensure delivery, and also including the consideration of issues such as risk. So we have a very active risk management strategy within the programme. We've always had that, and that is considered right up to Joint Delivery Board level. And I would also just sort of point out that I think Audit Scotland did conclude that the governance arrangements in place were effective.
I noted that. Thank you. I think my concern would be that perhaps the individual boxes have their own, let's call them review procedures, but it's how they all come together to make sure the important ones are picked up and dealt with from somebody at the top who can see how important these things are. So that's why I would be interested in saying, is there a way that if you raise something at your, was it the finance you mentioned there, could find its way to the whether it's the one you chair or the actual Scottish Government board?
Yeah, we've done a lot of work on our overarching governance to ensure that issues can be escalated swiftly and can flow. And I will certainly ensure that these issues that we've discussed today are considered at the assurance meeting for the portfolio areas that I have responsibility for, and that we take any learning that we can from this.
Can I just ask you about one other point? I think it was yourself that said we need to do more on evaluation. I think of the project and its outcomes. Why do you need to do more? I mean, is it you know what you need to do, or you need to find out what more you need to do?
We know what we need to do, and we are doing it. So this is a massive programme, as I've said. We know that we need really thorough, robust, short and longer term evaluation. That's underway. What we need to do more on is getting that really granular data, particularly equalities data, around those who are accessing early learning and childcare. And that's a programme of work that is underway at present to ensure that we do that. So at present we gather data and we have an annual census that looks at attendance and it looks at disability. We want to ensure that we're looking at a wider range of equalities data so that we can be clear about the impact of this programme going forward.
So just finally, if I may, you said you have a risk register for the programme. Who actually keeps that?
Alison, would be...
Sorry.
Yeah.
It's maintained. I have a professional programme management office that supports the running of the programme, and they would sort of maintain the housekeeping of the risk. The risk register. We have risk registers at various levels of the programme, so the individual national projects that are outlined there would capture individual project level risks that are considered at the project steering group, and then we have programme level risks that are considered at the joint delivery board level, but we do have a professional programme manager overseeing and ensuring that we're following best practice in our risk management approach.
So what's the number 2 risk, assuming COVID is the number 1 risk? The other risks that we have identified, and indeed COVID is identified as a significant risk. The other risks that we have at present would be around many of the issues that we've discussed today, for example, on completing the infrastructure projects and getting the workforce in place. Those 2 elements have tended to be the highest scoring risks throughout the programme, and the ones that have received the greatest focus through the Joint Delivery Board and the other governance arrangements, and in some cases they are unpacked into individual elements of those risks. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. We're now going to go remotely to Neil Bibby.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning, everybody. I just wanted to follow up some questions that members have raised. I wanted to start with the issue of take-up. Mr Johnston said that the take-up of universal, it was almost universal amongst 3- and 4-year-olds, and obviously the issue of 2-year-olds has been raised, and an indication was given that further work and a breakdown on that would be given. But do you have, are you able to give us an indication on the current uptake of eligible 2-year-olds as a percentage in Scotland? If not, what is the latest? And given the impact of COVID that's been mentioned, the possibility of a fall in employment, has there been a specific projection done on the possible increase in eligible 2-year-olds applying for childcare, and are you able to provide this?
Paul Johnson.
And over to Alison for some of the most up-to-date figures in a moment, if I may. But yes is the answer to that last question. We recognise that there is likely to be an increased number of parents who are eligible for the 2-year-old provision, and we are working to quantify what those numbers are likely to be. So we're looking at data, for example, in relation to increased unemployment, data in relation to increased entitlements to benefits, which would serve as the passports to the 2-year-old provision. We won't have definite numbers today, given how current all of this is. We are seeing growth in the 2-year-old uptake, and we're expecting that to grow significantly further. Alison will have the numbers most recently.
Thank you. The latest published figures for the ELC entitlement and uptake by 2-year-olds were that as at the September 2019 census, there were 5,990 2-year-olds accessing funded ELC, and that was 11% of the total 2-year-old population. We have challenges in obtaining Scotland level data for the eligible population of 2-year-olds, which is why we publish the percentage relative to the total number of 2-year-olds rather than eligibility. But we do, as Paul's saying, that we are monitoring and evaluating and analysing the data that's coming through about what appears to be happening to the number of people in receipt of qualifying benefits, and we are building this into, I think I referred earlier to a series of more detailed stocktake conversations that we were undertaking with local authorities in the coming weeks to inform the readiness for 1140, and we will be having specific discussions in those about what authorities are doing at local level to monitor the changes in their eligible to population. We've also been for a number of years we've been working in partnership to seek to improve the the take-up of the 2-year-old offer, and in order to improve take-up, to also ensure that those who are eligible are aware that it exists. And there's a number of ways through an improvement practicum that's taken place. We're also taking advantage of the opportunities of some of the communications around the Best Start Foods scheme in Scotland, for example, to reach eligible families. But what we've found consistently, including through the 9 authorities that participated in the improvement practicum last year, is that its existing trusted relationships with professionals is a key way in to families understanding that their eligibility, and then understanding what making use of that eligibility could offer to their children and to them as parents. So we're seeking to build on that where we can, and local authorities have been undertaking extensive work in that area also.
Neil Bibby.
Thank for that answer. 11% is a concerningly low figure, I think, and much more needs to be done on that. I would agree with that. Could I just wanted to follow up one of the questions I've asked about the workforce gap and the workforce gap that there currently is. It was mentioned by yourself, Alison, I think that a review was due to be carried out in April. It couldn't be, and I think that's understandable given the circumstances. But a date of September was also mentioned about a workforce review. For clarity, is this happening? Has that happened? When could we expect to get an update on the workforce currently?
Alison Cumming.
Thank you. So just one earlier point of clarification, that we estimate that our best estimate is that there's around, or pre-COVID, around 25% of the 2-year-old population would be eligible. But I have to stress that's an estimate, so the 11% should be compared to that 25% rather than to 100%. In relation to the workforce data, we have a data collection exercise underway at present with local authorities. The majority of authorities have returned that data to us. And we're analysing it, and we're working with the remaining authorities to collect the data, which will inform a progress report to the Joint Delivery Board. And as we've done with all our progress reports up till now, that progress report will be published at the time that the Joint Delivery Board meeting takes place. So it's likely to be, we don't have a confirmed date at the moment, but I would think it likely that it would be in October that we will have that information from all authorities, quality assured and published.
Neil Bibby.
And for the further information on 25% of 2-year-olds being eligible, but only 11% are accessing the entitlement for free childcare. I think that is, it's very concerning that there is such a low uptake on that. Given everything.
Apologies, Mr. Bibby. I think what Alison Cumming was suggesting was that 25% are eligible, and 25% of the population are eligible, and 11% of the population are taking the uptake, rather than 11% of the 25%. I think that's.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, I understand that point, convener. So 25% are the children living in poverty in Scotland, and 11% of the 25% means over half of children living in poverty aren't accessing their entitlement to 2-year-olds. So I still think that's a very concerning figure. I just wanted to lastly touch on the living wage. It's been mentioned about the living wage, and Alison, you also said that the living wage issue was not a straightforward issue. Yes, I'm very concerned. I think it's been deeply unfair that the expectations of low-paid workers have been raised in this regard. And I don't see why a commitment was made to a living wage when it's now being regarded as not enforceable or necessarily affordable. And I guess my question on that is, were ministers informed about this not being enforceable or affordable when the announcement was made?
Alison Cumming.
I would challenge the points that I think I made clear in my earlier answer. It is affordable. The funding is there in the multi-year funding settlement to set the sustainable rates that enable all childcare workers delivering the funded entitlement to be paid at least the real living wage. I would also say that the issues are known around, and I would say enforceability here. We are talking in very strict sort of legal sense of enforceability. There is a very strong commitment across the sector, and we are to move to payment of the real living wage. The strong policy commitment is there, the commitment of the sector is there, and I've outlined, and we can provide even further detail if the committee would like it, on the mechanisms that we have put in place to the best of our ability within the powers of this Parliament to ensure that that can be secured through contractual arrangements.
Mr Bibby.
Okay, thanks for those answers.
Thank you. Just to clarify, when you say it's affordable, is it affordable for those that are getting the revenue negative funding? Because that's quite a bold assertion to make for those that aren't getting adequate funding.
So,
Alison Cumming.
Thank you. It is affordable in terms of the funding settlement. We also know that all authorities are paying, are increasing their rates and paying sustainable rates. So I don't have any evidence that it is not affordable at either individual local authority level or at Scotland-wide level.
Okay. We're now going to be joined remotely by Beatrice Wishart.
Thank you, Convener, and thank you for allowing me to participate this morning. There's been a lot of issues raised that have been hugely informative, not least the issues about data collection and data gathering. I mean, early on, before COVID, there was issues about trying to know at local level throughout the rollout where exactly they were in relation to individual local authorities, and we struggled to get some information about that, but that was the kind of information that would have been very useful to parents and families who needed to plan and who needed to budget accordingly. So I am pleased to hear that there's going to be much more data gathering, much more coming out in the coming months, and Paul Johnson referred to high quality data, so we look forward to receiving that. And I would echo what Neil Bibby has said in terms of the eligible 2-year-olds. That 11% figure does seem extremely low when we're looking at those that are most in need. On that same theme, could I ask about monitoring another vulnerable group? We know that the lack of access to childcare during the crisis has left women particularly vulnerable to losing work. So is the government monitoring this? For example, do you have any understanding of whether more women have become unemployed during the course of pandemic, specifically in relation to not being able to access the childcare or 1140, and how would that be monitored going forward?
Paul Johnson coming in on that?
I'll take it first in, and what I would do is I would agree that we need to ensure we've got a real understanding as to the implications of rising unemployment on women and of course also on men. This policy has got a very significant gender dimension to it all. I think the 1140 hours has been recognised as a policy which will be hugely supportive in terms of gender or pursuing gender equality. And I'd come to that second of the 3 long-term objectives that I set out at the start, namely supporting parents to access jobs, training and education. And what I think is going to be critical is that we work with providers to ensure that we are putting that support in place. Through our current focus on child poverty, I can confirm that we are investing quite significant sums of money to support parental employment initiatives. What is clear is I think that COVID is going to make that all the more necessary, given the rising unemployment that we're looking at. Now, whether we have specific figures for the differential impact of unemployment on women and men, I do not know at this stage, but perhaps my colleague Alison would be able to confirm if we have that information.
can't comment on the specific information, but what I can say is that we published an initial impact assessment in May in relation to the childcare closures, and we're just going through, and also the provision of critical childcare, and we are also going through the final clearance stages at the moment to publish a full equalities impact assessment on the recovery arrangements. And I think it's also been evident throughout the Scottish Government route map that priority has been given to reopening childcare as soon as it has been safe to do so. And that's informed by many factors, but including an acute awareness of how the burden of childcare is impacted on parents, and particularly women, over this period. So we saw a phased reopening of the childcare sector, with childminders and outdoor nurseries able to open from the 3rd of June, and the remainder of the childcare sector able to open from the 15th of July, albeit with public health measures and guidance in place. But we'd certainly be happy to provide information to the committee and a link to the updated equalities impact assessment when it's published.
Thank you, Alison Cumming. Back to Beatrice Wishart.
Thank you for that.
Thank you. If there are no other questions from members of the committee, I think we've given that a good hearing this morning. No other questions. With that, I'll just thank our witnesses, Alison Cumming, Paul Johnson, Sarah Waters, Eddie Follen, and Matthew Sweeney, who's joined us remotely. And I now close the public part of this committee as we move into private session. Thank you.